Hey everyone, welcome to another AP Environmental Science lecture. Today we're going to look over weathering and soil. And what soil is, it's this combination of this geologic rock material along with organic material that's forming this membrane over the surface of the earth. So there's a variety of processes that occur in soil that connect this overlying biology with the overlying biology with the geology underneath it. So in this lecture, we're going to explore the weathering of rocks that leads to the formation of the soil and the development of the soil horizons. And we're also going to look at the physical, chemical, and biological processes that take place in the soils. So let's get started. So first thing, again, like we said, we're going to look at how this weathering erosion is going to contribute to this recycling of the elements, creating that essential soil, that overlying biology that's so necessary to life. So the first thing with weathering, I want you to think of weathering as making a mess. It's just breaking down of rock exposed at the Earth's surface. And there's two types. There's the physical or mechanical, where rock is physically being broken apart into smaller pieces, or it's chemically being altered. And we're going to look at both right now. When we talk about physical weathering, like I said, it's this mechanical or this physical breaking down of rock. So the rock is getting smaller and smaller, but at the end of the day, it's still the same rock, which will make sense here as we move on to chemical. This can be done a few ways. You can have frost wedging. We all know when water freezes, it expands. So you get an area where there's a little bit of water seeps in the crack of the rocks, temperatures drop overnight, they freeze, expand. So it's a very slow process. But again, this over time will break apart the rock, as you can see in the picture on the bottom right. There's actually a video you can watch on the lecture if you're downloading. So it takes you through the whole process of how freeze and thaw works. Biologically, there's living things that can take apart rocks. And in this case, on the left, it looks like there wouldn't be much soil for that tree to establish itself. But sure enough, it's found a crack in the rock. The seed made its way down. It had the right conditions to survive. So you can see slowly this tree is breaking apart the rock. And we all know about burrowing animals like prairie dogs, things of that nature. They also break apart rock as well. So this is another example of biological weathering through a mechanical process. Another is what we call exfoliation. And deep underground, you have this solid rock. There's no weathering occurring because it's underground. But when it's exposed to the surface, you have this expansion. There's been uplift. There's finally that weight that's been on it has been lifted. So it exfoliates, very similar to, imagine when you exfoliate your skin, the outside of your skin. The layers of your skin fall off, and the same is happening in this here at a Half Dome in Yosemite. And again, there's another great video if you have the lecture, but literally this process will, the rock literally breaks apart again due to exfoliation. Moving on to chemical weathering. So what we have here is the actual, whatever the rock initially started out as is being changed chemically. And it's breaking down, the minerals are changing. There can be a few things like chemical reactions or dissolving of chemicals from the rocks. And you can see this picture might look familiar to you. If you're in Vegas, you have the Red Rock Visitor Center. But that red rock we see is a perfect example of chemical weathering, which we'll talk about here. So you have that rock, and what it is, there was an abundance of iron in that rock. And that iron, with a combination of rainwater and oxygen, just like anything else, forms rust. So essentially that's what's happening to the areas of red rock. And you see this all over the Southwest United States. So this is a perfect example of, again, chemical weathering. Human-induced, though, we have our acid rain. So we have acidic gases like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides that are being released from the combustion of fossil fuels. They end up in the atmosphere. They get incorporated into clouds as condensation nuclei, and then the gases dissolve in that rainwater as it forms back to Earth. And you may have seen this in a few, not only does it to the natural rock and landscape, but maybe if you've ever been to Europe, those very old statues, since the Industrial Revolution, rain has been much more acidic, so we're seeing these weather much faster. Or even the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty is actually copper when it was given to the United States by France, but over time, copper turns green because of this chemical reaction. So we have our two types of weathering, our mechanical and chemical. So rock is being broken down at the surface. As I mentioned before, that's making a mess. Think of erosion as cleaning up that mess. So erosion, what's going to happen is is going to physically remove the rock from the landscape or ecosystem. And this is mainly done by water. You can have a river carving a valley, and as it does, it carries the sediment with it. You've all been to the beach before. Waves crashing on the beach will eventually cut those cliffs back. And even again, our ice with glaciers. But aside from water, you can also have wind. Living in Las Vegas, you're sure familiar with that, how wind will pick up dust and small particles, move it to another place, and then gravity itself. Over time, landslides and a combination of water and gravity will result in erosion as well. So make sure you know the two types. So now we have our rock is weathered, our rock has been eroded, and this is where it brings it all together when we're talking about soil. So we're linking this rock cycle with this biosphere, and there's so many different functions that the soil serves as. We all know that plants need healthy soil to grow. Filtering water, we're going to, as this course moves on, you're going to see how essential it is that water infiltrating the ground, how it's slowly cleaned and purified for us to use again. We all know it's a habitat for living organisms, and we'll see by the end of this lecture how these living organisms are in turn providing a healthy soil to grow these plants. And just like it filters water, pollutants are pulled out from the ground and water as well. So how does this soil form? We're going to start on the top left, and the first thing it takes is lots of time. And when you see that word parent rock, just imagine that as just solid rock, and think back maybe a few chapters we talked about primary succession, where you started with maybe a parking lot or a volcanic eruption, and you just have this solid igneous rock on this island like Hawaii, for example. So over a very long amount of time, soil is going to form. So again, when you see that parent rock, that's just what we're starting with, and eventually leading to this mature soil with lots of organics, lots of humus, and we'll get to that here moving on. So what determines soil? There's 5 major factors. There's that parent material, which we talked about. What is that bedrock we're starting with? And again, that will depend on where you are in the world. And again, it's that inorganic. It could be from an igneous, metamorphic, or sedimentary rock. The climate is a very important aspect, as depending on where you are in regards to what part of the world, you could have, like tropical rainforests that have much more healthier soil than, let's say, a desert. So the soil that develops in the humid tropics is accelerated by this rapid weathering of rock and minerals, leaching of nutrients. And the climate also has an indirect effect on soil formation because it affects what type of vegetation is going to develop, and then what detritus is left over when the vegetation dies. Topography comes into play because the surface of the slope and the arrangement of landscape is going to result in what soil forms. So soils that are on a steep slope, that are constantly subjected to erosion, and on occasion more drastic mass movements like a landslide, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, that's really going to have an effect on the soil, whereas the soil that form at the bottom of a steep slope may continually accumulate material from higher elevations and become quite deep. Organisms are huge. We already talked about animals that tunnel or burrow, for example, like earthworms, gophers, voles. They're very, very important because they mix the soil, distributing organic and mineral matter. So organisms act as recyclers for this organic matter. And then we always need time. Time is the final factor. It determines the properties of a soil and which soil has developed. So as a soil ages, they develop a variety of characteristics. So grassland soils are going to support much of the food crop and livestock feed production in the U.S., and these are relatively old soils. So again, where you are and how long this develops comes into is a factor. And unfortunately, we also have soil degradation, and what's happening here is the loss, or some of the loss of the soil's ability to support plant growth. And by looking at this map, we can see there's lots of factors that determine soil degradation. It could be overwatering, you could have an increase in wind, chemicals in regards to fertilizers, pesticides, physically moving, which we'll look at later in the chapter, like mining. And so there's tons of different ways that soil can be degraded. And a perfect example is what happened January of 2018. What we have here is the Montecito mudslides. And what's quite interesting is it happened right after the largest forest fire in California history. So you can see they called it the Thomas Fire up here. The extent of it, this part of California, the Santa Ynez Mountains, it's a very steep topography. They're at the base of these mountains. And unfortunately, what happened was you had a forest fire through the whole area, and then you can see the amount of rain that fell. There were some places that had about an inch of rain in 15 minutes. So why this is important, because if we look at the picture on the left, had that forest fire not happened, you would have had our parent rock, but above the parent rock, we would have had topsoil with, a root system from plants, detritus, leaves, rotting material, organisms, and that rain would have fallen and seeped through the soil and everything would have been okay. But again, unfortunately, we had a forest fire about a month before. That land lay barren. We have an intense amount of rain falling all at once. So all that rock, ash, and clay is just sitting there. It was the perfect storm. Didn't have any porosity, and all that just flooded and came down the slope. So just one example of degradation. Okay, we're going to finish up with horizons now. So just like a horizon is your looking out into the horizon, it's the left to right. It's this layer in the soil has these distinct features, and it's going to change depending on where you're at, but they're going to have these certain textures and certain colors. And we're going to start from the top and work our way down. So we're going to start with the O horizon. The O horizon is all the organic material. So again, someplace like a temperate forest where you have leaves that fall on the ground every year, all that material has to rot and decay. They have a lot of organic. They have a large O horizon. Whereas somewhere in the desert where you don't have much rotting plant material, it's not going to have much of an O horizon. So what we have is this detritus that's being broken down and it's being decomposed. Underneath the O horizon, we have our A horizon. And this is normally referred to as topsoil. So what's happening here, it's this zone of organic material and minerals, and they're mixing. And they're mixing together and help with animals and fungus that are breaking the material down, and then the minerals that are found in the bedrock below. You would think after A would be B, but to make things difficult, it goes O, A, E. So the E horizon, what's happening here, there's leaching. And what leaching is imagine up here it rains, that water is going to seep down. That is what we call leaching or alluviation. Some of that organic material is going to seep down through A and end up in E. So our E horizon is after the A, it's allowing that mineral and organic to kind of mix. And what we often see is we find these in acidic soils. So again, like tropical rainforests. Underneath our E, we have our B, and this is the mineral material. This is because you'll see after B, we have our next horizon where it's the parent rock. So most minerals are here. There's just a breaking down of the bedrock below it. So we won't see very much organic matter, which makes sense because that organic matter is up here from that grass, leaves decaying, all that sort of stuff. It's got a long ways to go to get to B. So that's why we normally see that, just mostly minerals in the B horizon. Finally, with our C, this is the one that's most covered up, mostly bedrock. So you're not going to find much here. Basically, it is similar to the parent material, again, because we're closer to that bedrock. And that is the bottom of our soil horizon. So make sure you know your layers. Moving on, we're going to look at certain properties of soil. So soil with different properties serve different functions for humans. So for example, some soil types are good for growing crops. Others are more suited for building a housing development. So we have to understand the physical, chemical, and biological properties of these soil. So when we look at physical, what we're doing is we're looking at size and weight. So if you look at the bottom right here, you can see clay and silt are incredibly small compared to sand. whereas that's going to play a huge role in how water moves through the soil as well. And the texture is huge as well. So what we do is when we look at texture, we're looking at the percentage of sand, silt, and clay. And we'll go over more of this in class, and you'll need to be able to read one of these and determine the percentage of sand, clay, and silt on the exam. So understand, if we look here, our dot is here in the middle of loam. We can say loam, we can follow the lines that it's on. Loam is 40% sand, 20% clay, and 40% silt. If you ever get confused, always follow the line that leads to a lower value. So I could see where you get confused. If I'm sitting here, do I go towards the 60 towards sand, or do I go towards the 40? Again, do I go towards the 60 in clay, or do I go towards the 20? You're always going to go to the lower number. Something else that's also important is what we call permeability. So think, if something is impermeable, you cannot penetrate. Let's say a castle. They built castles to be impermeable, so no one could storm the castle. So permeability is dependent on this texture that we just looked at. So you can see here, depending on what the consistency of the soil is, sand, you can see in about an hour the water will drain. Silt will take 100 days, and clay 100 years. So again, this is a huge role, which we'll see, especially when for farming. The best farming soil has a mixture of sand, silt, and clay. So it has a little bit of everything. And the reason why the sand does so well, it's these loosely packed materials that drain quickly. And we can see clay is not so great. Looking on the chemical properties. So with chemical properties, these are going to determine how the soil functions. And what we mean by that is what plants are going to be able to survive in these types of soils. Cation exchange capacity. All a cation is imagine it's these mineral ions that are nutrients for plants. So CEC, what we say is, how easy are plants able to absorb and release these mineral nutrients that they need? So it's important to note that clay has the largest influence. Clay is able to attract positively charged mineral ions, as we can see in the picture, and as a result, those positively charged, like potassium, calcium, things the plants need, they're attracted to clay, and then the plant is able to receive them from the clay. As we pointed out, though, which I'm sure you're thinking right now, is you don't want a lot of clay in your soil because, again, it's not going to allow water to penetrate. So you cannot have more than 20% clay. You want soil with clay in it because, again, remember, clay allows the transfer of the cations. But, again, anything more than 20% clay is not going to allow the water to permeate. Moving on to acids and bases. So bases, it's important to note, promote plant growth. Acids are going to prevent, but it's important you have a good mix or a proportion. So our base saturation looks at the percentage of acids to bases. So again, you do want some, let's say, iron and manganese in your soil. You don't want a lot because these are acidic, but these bases will kind of even each other out. So soil with a high CEC and a high base saturation are usually our highest productive soils. So make sure you understand both of that. Finally, we're going to look at the biological properties of soil. There's lots of activity going on in soil, even though, from the top, it doesn't look like much is going on. But you have fungi breaking down dead material. You have bacteria. You have protozoans. These make up 80 to 90% of the soil. So although it looks dead to us, there's plants growing in it, but there's a lot of activity going on that's essential for healthy soil. We do have animals like voles or earthworms do play a huge role, especially to the mixing of the soil. They'll allow all this dead material that's being consumed by the fungus or the snails, allows it to mix. That makes it easily for the plants to use. But it's also important to mention that earthworms are what's producing the humus, not hummus, the humus. So earthworms play a big role as well. So that is your overview of weathering and soil. Make sure you know those horizons. Always understand that weathering is breaking down, erosion is cleaning up. As always, the website's available to you, as am I. See ya.